Okay, so we finally get to the point where we get to move our bodies, and we're going to talk about movement for a little while. And I'm going to discuss first the different kinds of muscles and their movements. And what I usually tell my students at the beginning of movement is once we get into these, once we get out of sensation perception, and especially when we're out of the brain itself, I get a little bit uncomfortable as this is not really my background. I'm more about sensing and perceiving than apparently moving around. And all of these sections that have the movere, that kind of Latin root, movement, emotion, motivation, they're not my strengths. But I'm going to start, as I always do, not in the brain, with movements and especially we're going to start with the muscles to begin with. The smooth muscle being shown there in A are the muscles that can make up the different organs like the intestines, the stomach, and so forth. At the middle in B, we're seeing skeletal muscles. They're often called striated muscles. These are usually when we're talking about working out and working on our muscles. This or someone's muscles. This is what we're talking about. So they're helping to move our body. And then in C, your author shows cardiac muscles, which are found in the heart, and they are more fused together because they're going to be contracting together instead of independently. If we look at where muscles receive their input, a muscle is going to receive input from only a single axon. Okay, and an axon may innervate many muscles. The more muscles an axon is innervating or communicating with, the less precise the movement. So our eyes, which have very precise movement, have one axon communicating to about 3 muscles. And we move our eyes almost exactly to where we want them to move, maybe a little tiny correction, but they are very precise in their movements. Whereas the biceps, we have one axon to more than 100 muscle fibers, and this is a much less precise kind of movement. Okay, and a neuromuscular junction is the synapse between a motor neuron and a muscle fiber. All skeletal muscles, we have the motor neuron is releasing acetylcholine in order for that skeletal muscle to contract. And we really only have the movement of contraction where we have these muscles that act in pairs, and they contract where the muscle gets shorter and thicker, or they relax where really there's no signal. The muscle gets longer and thinner, but it's a lack of a signal, or really, as you saw with the Charles Sherrington, an inhibition to that muscle. So moving an arm or a leg back and forth requires these pairs of muscles which act in opposing sets. Okay, so they're usually referred to as antagonistic muscles, a flexor and an extensor, where the biceps, the flexor, we are, and if you want to go ahead, so I usually do this in front of the class and make my little muscle. And if you want to go ahead and put your hand on the, so that it is on the top and the bottom of your arm and holding that, when you're bringing your muscle to you, that biceps is what, the biceps muscles are what are contracting, and the triceps are relaxing. Whereas when we are extending our muscle, so especially if you're holding a weight or something, that you're gonna be able to feel that triceps then is the one contracting, and the biceps is relaxing. Your author starts out this section of fast and slow muscles saying, imagine you are a fish, where fish have red, pink, and white muscles. And most of the time they're using these red and pink muscles that are not making very vigorous contractions, but they're aerobic, so they can just kind of move through the water and not fatigue. But then he says, imagine you're in cold water and something bigger comes after you. Can you get away? Well, you're going to use more muscles to move quickly. You're going to use some of these white muscles as well, which are allowing for fast contractions and quick movements, but you're going to fatigue quickly. Well, mammals have various kinds of muscle fibers mixed together, and we call our muscle fibers slow twitch fibers and fast twitch fibers, where again, the slow twitch fibers are, they provide less vigorous contractions and they're not going to fatigue. They are aerobic. They are using oxygen. The fast twitch fibers give us fast contractions, but they also fatigue quickly. So they are anaerobic. They are not using oxygen, and so they're going to build up an oxygen debt. And when we're using them, we're going to have to then take a break so that we can rebuild our oxygen and use them again. For slow twitch fibers, he gives the example of the fibers in our faces that allow us to talk. So most of us don't fatigue very quickly. We can talk for a really long time without feeling, oh, like my lips and my face are tired of talking. He also gives the example of a long bicycle ride using both of these kinds of fibers, so that we're going to start out using our slow twitch fibers, and we're going to be using that oxygen. They're not going to be fatiguing, but they're also going to be using glucose. And as we're using more and more glucose, eventually we're going to activate this gene that inhibits muscles from using glucose, because we need to save some of that glucose for use in our brain. Our neurons also need glucose. And so when we are running out of glucose and our slow twitch fibers aren't going to be able to be used anymore, we switch over to those fast twitch fibers. But now we're going to see that those muscles are going to gradually fatigue as they're going to build up an oxygen debt. Okay, so the other things I have on this picture are over to the right in B. From both of these are from Laura Freeberg. So in B, she's showing how when we are doing something like lifting weights, that that fast contraction, so the fast twitch fiber is being used at the sort of beginning of that lifting of weight. But as we're continuing to do this, we're using our slow twitch fiber. And again, it's not as fast a contraction, and it's not going to fatigue so quickly, or it's not really going to fatigue. It's going to stop using glucose. The other thing she shows in A of this picture is, so I'm going to start at the bottom with the elite marathon runner and the extreme endurance athlete. So these people who are doing these really long-term use of their muscles are going to build up those slow twitch fibers. And your author actually gives the example of someone in the book who, I hope I still have it on the page, who once ran 3,521 kilometers in 50 days. So that person has built up some serious slow twitch fibers. And my brother also built up some serious slow twitch fibers. At one time he left here in Columbia and met us up at Sunset Beach in North Carolina. We drove, and he started at 5 o'clock in the morning and rode his bicycle up there, met us there in the evening. So, and he's also followed the Tour de France a couple times. So those people are building up their slow twitch fibers. People like, and so I'm going to skip up to the elite sprinter. People like the elite sprinter are really building up those fast twitch fibers, and especially you can see the type 2A fibers, but not building up those slow twitch fibers. And otherwise, with people who are less active, we're going to see these other kinds of fast twitch fibers, the type 2B. So typically an active person has some of those, has a mixture of fibers. We compare that to someone with a spinal cord injury who really isn't using muscles at all. We can see that they have more of these type 2B fast twitch fibers. Okay, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about the proprioceptors and how they help control muscle movement. So proprioceptor is any receptor that is detecting the position or movement of the body and then communicating that information to the brain. So muscle proprioceptors detect the stretch and tension of a muscle. When a muscle is stretched, the spinal cord sends a reflexive signal to contract the muscle. And I usually start by talking from this patellar reflex. So what they do to test our neurological fitness, basically in the doctor's office, is to strike just under the patella, right? And what that does is that stretches the quadriceps muscle, and that's going to send a signal to the spinal cord in that lumbar 3 region. It's going to synapse with an interneuron in the spinal cord, and then that's going to communicate to an alpha motor neuron that's going to communicate back to the quadriceps that causes the quadriceps to contract. And we're also going to see a relaxation of the hamstring, that antagonistic flexor muscle. And so our leg is going to extend out. And I'm going to talk about a couple of different kinds of proprioceptors. One is the muscle spindle, which is running parallel to the muscle, and it's going to sense or receive information about the stretch of a muscle, and it's going to send back negative feedback. So when stretched, it's going to cause a contraction that opposes that stretch. Another kind of proprioceptor are what's called Golgi tendon organs. So these, instead of running along parallel to the muscle, are located at the tendons at the opposite ends of the muscles. They're going to respond to increased muscle tension. And I'm going to show an example of this in a second that comes from another textbook, but I think it helps to understand this kind of difference between stretch and tension, and hopefully it will help. And what they're doing is they're exciting interneurons that are then going to inhibit motor neurons. And they act as a brake against this kind of excessively vigorous contraction so that we aren't hurting ourselves, basically, with muscle contraction. Okay, I'm going to try and walk us through this picture. I found this really helpful. I think this is from Neil Carlson's textbook on physiological psychology. And I'm just reminding you up there that the muscle spindle, the different kinds of proprioceptors, muscle spindles that are really stretch or length detectors and are running along parallel to the muscle, and then the Golgi tendon organs, which are detecting tension and telling us about the total amount of stretch that is exerted. Okay, so in A, and you can do some of these things, so eventually I'm going to ask you guys to do something like juggling or throwing something up and down so that you're catching it. But right now, you're just going to kind of pretend along with me, hopefully. So if you are holding your arm kind of just straight in a right angle, like in the picture, and then we move our arm down. Okay, so that's we're just passively lowering the arm. What's happening is you can see the muscle spindle 1 is one kind of muscle spindle that is running along parallel, and it is now starting to fire faster as that muscle is being stretched. Muscle spindle 2 is not really responding to that, and the Golgi tendon organ is also not responding to that. The Golgi tendon, organs in this case. So in all cases, because they're at both sides of the muscles. Okay, now we're going to drop our arm more rapidly or abruptly. And so now we see, as I drop my arm rapidly or abruptly, muscle spindle 1 is going to start firing similarly as it did before, because it is just receiving information about the stretch of the muscle. Muscle spindle 2 is going to now respond in a burst at that abrupt kind of drop. Okay, that sudden change. And again, the Golgi tendon organs are not changing because there's no difference in the tension. And so now we're going to have our arm at a right angle, and we're going to drop something into our hand that has some weight to it. And that's going to lower our hand for a second as we kind of have this response, especially it depends on the weight. We have this response where our hand goes down a little bit and then comes back up, okay, to where it was before. And so we're back at a right angle. And what we see, muscle spindle 1 is having that same kind of response to the dropping of the arm. And then as we reach it back up to the right angle, it's going to go back to what I assume is like spontaneous firing. It's not really responding much. Muscle spindle 2 is going to respond to when the weight is added when we drop our arm, and then we move our arm back up into position, and then it goes back to its spontaneous firing. And now the Golgi tendon organ, we have that weight dropped, and that tension that is on the muscle is going to cause that to fire, and it's going to continue to fire because we're still holding the weight. And so the exact stretch of the muscle is not what's so important there as it is the tension of the muscle. So the proprioceptors are providing the brain with information. And again, you can try the demo. I'm going to continue to suggest that every time he has this little box that says try it yourself, those are really great things to try so that you are applying this to something in real life and not just reading the scientific, yes, this is what's happening. But it's hard to find the appropriate tools for this, but if you can, you find something that is small and dense or heavy, and then something that is larger but lighter and less dense. And you have somebody drop the small heavy object, and you have this kind of compensatory response to that. And then as you somebody drops the larger object after the smaller object, you have this expectation for a larger kind of compensatory response, but it feels different. And really, your proprioceptors are telling you about that difference and about that experience. I also use the example of Ian Waterman oftentimes to talk about the importance of this information coming to the brain. So Ian Waterman had, if I remember correctly, he was working for a butcher. He was very young, and he had some kind of flu or fever that, for whatever reason, it caused this problem where his autoimmune system attacked that medial lemniscal pathway. So he could no longer feel the touch on his body, and he could no longer feel the information coming back from these proprioceptors. And he was, luckily, still able to perceive pain. So I didn't actually talk when we talked about pain, but sometimes I remember too about people who don't feel pain, but it's really dangerous, as they're not going to feel when they're getting frostbite, or when they've broken an arm, or when their appendix bursts. All of these things that really pain is telling us to avoid. Continuing to hurt ourselves or to move some arm that is broken, and so forth. So he could still feel pain. So in a way, he was kind of lucky. But when you read about his experience, you realize how really disturbing this would be. Okay. First of all, he worked at a butcher's, and he could no longer work there, as there's just too much danger around for somebody who can't really feel their body. But he would discuss things like, talk about how lying in bed feels just like floating in space. And what he learned to do was to monitor his movements and himself through eye movements, through looking around to figure out where he was, because his body wasn't giving him that information. And so there is a story of him being caught in an elevator that breaks down for a little while in the dark, and just crumpling to the floor, because without that visual information, it was just he just doesn't know where his body is or what it's doing, and it was just overwhelming and upsetting to him. So he just kind of crumpled to the floor. So yes, our proprioceptors give us really important information to tell us about the movement of our body, the tension on our bodies, and so forth. Your author has this section discussing units of movement, where we're going to distinguish between voluntary and involuntary movements. So those reflexes, as I was just talking about, the patellar reflex, are involuntary and largely involuntary. I sometimes use the example of if we touch something hot, we have this kind of reflex, and to, again, a large extent, that's an involuntary movement. But we can have brain activity affecting this. So for example, I usually use the example of holding a casserole dish. So if I'm pick up my casserole dish and it's kind of hot, it's kind of burning my hands, it's really too hot. I don't want to drop it, right, as I'm carrying it to the table, as I'd break my casserole dish and ruin my dinner and all that stuff. But I can inhibit that reflex. There are reflexes that we simply cannot inhibit. So the patellar reflex is one, which is why they use that as a measure of the nervous system activity, and to make sure that we are neurologically sound. And so most of our movements are some mixture of voluntary and involuntary components. So as I'm starting to walk, as I start that first step, it's a voluntary kind of thing, but we already start this kind of mixture of these involuntary components of what is kind of this natural walking, as we put down the one leg, we just lift up the other leg and it comes back down. And there are also the involuntary components of, as we're walking someplace, for example, I usually use the bricks at USC where we are making these compensatory movements so that we're not kind of tripping over ourselves as we go too far or not far enough in one place because of the weirdness of how the bricks are. Our body has these reflexive kinds of compensatory movements that we're really not very aware of. But even just the movement of the legs is largely, once we get started, largely reflexive. He also discusses here reactions from spontaneous activity, or explains the differences between when we're reacting to something versus having spontaneous behavior, which we'll discuss a little bit again when we talk about Parkinson's disease, as the basal ganglia are really important for this initiation of spontaneous behavior. But so he talks here about Westerns and gunfights and how usually it's the bad guy, okay, the quote bad guy, who is starting the gunfight, and then the good guy draws faster and shoots the bad guy. This is our old Westerns used to work. And you might wonder if how realistic that is. And he's basically arguing that it is kind of realistic. So they've done research to look at this kind of spontaneous behavior versus reactions, where they were watching people who, I'm going to forget the study, where they either do something with their right hand or do something with their left hand, and whatever the one person starts, the other person is supposed to mimic. And it's up to the two people whether or not they are the starter, the person who starts. Well, it looks like the person who is reacting to the other person, so not the one who's initiating that spontaneous behavior, is approximately 9% faster than the one who is initiating the spontaneous action. So it does work out for our old Westerns if you're into that kind of thing. I almost always include my infant reflexes here, partly because I really like to show pictures of babies. I don't come off as a very warm person very often because I kind of have a lot of material to go through, and it's this really scientific kind of material. But here we have babies, and we're going to see a number of reflexes here that we are born with that we lose in those first few months. Okay, so one is the grasp reflex. If we put something into a baby's hand, like our finger, they are going to have just this reflex of grasping that. It looks like this was particularly helpful when in our ancestry that monkeys would grasp at their moms. And if we strike along, so then B shows the Babinski reflex. If we kind of move our hand or put our hand on the sole of the foot, and especially if we kind of strike forward, strike up, we're going to see this Babinski reflex where the small toes fan out and the big toe goes in the opposite direction, as they kind of just have this reflex. Both of these don't really work on older people, okay? If you do the Babinski, so you strike along someone's foot, it's probably going to be ticklish and they're going to pull it away. And mostly if you put your hand on, if you go ahead and just put your finger to someone's hand, they might think you're weird, but they don't have this kind of grasping reflex. Interestingly, that is so these are things that we learn to inhibit. I mean, we lose them in the first few months of life, but it looks like we're learning to inhibit these. And so if you have somebody who you think maybe has had way too much to drink, you might try putting something in their hand, and you can see that they will have this reflexive grabbing of whatever that is. And that is, then you should definitely take their keys away and maybe really look out for them because they're in trouble. Another thing we are born with is the rooting reflex. So if we touch the side of a baby's cheek, they have this rooting reflex of moving their head to that, and actually whatever. So This would probably be the next thing, is the sucking reflex. Whatever, if that thing is still there when their mouth gets there, they're gonna have a sucking reflex as well. And this is apparently helpful for finding the breast and then sucking and getting milk.